Israel is now retreating from Gaza after over a year of genocide. We saw 1 million, perhaps Palestinians marching back to northern Gaza to their homes, which are mainly now just rubble. The Israeli media has highlighted IDF troops crying on their way out of Gaza as they've been forced back due to the ceasefire out of the Netzarim corridor. And there's been a lot made, Professor Morandi, about the embarrassment that Hamas and the Palestinian resistance are placing upon Israeli defense forces as they give up their prisoners of war in a manner that is believed to humiliate Israel. For example, giving up prisoners of war in front of the home, the destroyed home of Yahya Sinwar. Professor Martini, what do you make of these developments? What does it tell us about the overall regional situation in Gaza and beyond?
If you recall, and I'm sure your viewers can check whenever they like, I've been saying that the Israeli regime will fail in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the Red Sea from the very beginning. And others like myself were saying this since October last year, meaning 15 months ago. The Israelis were bound to be defeated in Gaza, despite the horrific massacres and the genocide, the Holocaust. The Palestinians were determined from day one that they will hold their ground. And Hamas and its allies showed the Israelis that they are not the power that they were before. In the decades before the rise of the axis of resistance, whenever the Israelis wanted to invade a neighboring country, whether Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, they would advance swiftly and take large amounts of land. They went all the way to Beirut, they took the West Bank, they took the Golan, and of course they went all the way across the Sinai very easily and very swiftly. But this time round in Gaza, they were stuck. And in Lebanon, we saw the most heavy fighting ever between the Israeli regime and a power outside of its borders. The battle in southern Lebanon on the border was very heavy. The fighting was extraordinarily heavy, but Hezbollah held its ground, and the Israeli regime was unable to take a single city, even a small city or a large town. It failed completely. And while many were martyred in Gaza and in Lebanon, and civilians were slaughtered, and resistance fighters on both to the south and the north were martyred, but the Israelis failed. And we also saw in the Red Sea for over 15 months, the Americans tried to crush the resistance there too, so that the Israelis could use the Red Sea to strengthen their economy, to carry out the genocide more easily. They failed. They failed across the board. This was all expected. The only thing that was unexpected was Syria. And Syria, as I said from the very beginning, was a tactical victory for Netanyahu, Erdogan, and Biden. But I think in the long run, actually, Syria is not going to end well for any of these actors, because Al Qaeda in Syria is not going to be able to control the country. We're already seeing the slaughter of people who they feel are a threat. We see that they're incapable of governing, and we also see that countries across the region and across Asia are wary, very wary of Al Qaeda. Countries that like China, Russia, Central Asian countries, where many of these fighters come from, they're concerned, and they're concerned about what Mr. Erdogan is doing. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan are concerned. Jolani is trying to strengthen relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis are worried because these extremists in Syria have ambitions that go beyond the borders of Syria, and many of them are far more extreme than Jolani, or at least today, Jolani today. Otherwise, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. He was Abu Bakr Baghdadi's deputy. He killed thousands of people in car bombs across Iraq. But the Jolani today, uh, he is going to have a very tough time dealing with the more extreme elements that have taken Damascus, and that, as I said, is a threat to the West, because the countries that are threatened by these extremist groups are in the Western camp. So I think this has been a major defeat for Israel. The last 16 months, been almost 16 months now, have been disastrous. And the most important element of all is that the regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the global majority. Even in the West, even in the United States, you see people like Tucker Carlson saying things that were not said before. Candace Owens, these are people on the right, and among other groups in American civil society, we see huge opposition towards Zionism and the regime itself. And therefore, I think that that is the most devastating aspect of this conflict, the fact that they have not just the Israeli regime, but the collective West. It has destroyed its image across the world because they've been partner to this genocide. So it is understandable for these Israeli soldiers to weep and cry because they've invested so much in this genocide, and ultimately they've been forced to pull out. That doesn't mean the war is over, because it is quite possible that the ceasefire will collapse. We have to see what Netanyahu does. We'll have to see where Trump takes this. But if the ceasefire moves forward, it is a catastrophic defeat for the regime. And if they continue with the genocide, I think the defeat will be even more catastrophic, because the world is now uh, witnessing these soldiers being released. The images are very bad for Israel. Seeing these women soldiers well fed, these all of the Israelis well fed, well taken care of. It again rips apart the narrative of the West and the Israeli regime, Western media, Western governments, Western think tanks, Western journalists. Their narrative has been ripped apart, and then of course they don't show the thousands of Palestinians who are being released, the women and the children, many of them who were uh, just taken hostage and never charged. But we see how many of them were battered, how many of them have broken teeth, and many of them suffering from malnutrition. This has been catastrophic for the regime. And if the genocide resumes, I think the world will be much more angry than even it has been over the past few months.
Just devastating reports, Professor Marandi. Israeli media have taken polls where only 4% of Israelis themselves believe that the objectives in Gaza that Israel set forth for itself have been accomplished. There's also, as you said, Syria reports now that so-called pro-Assad forces have begun operations against Israel. And it seems like these ceasefires, both in Gaza and Lebanon, are hanging on by a thread. And that one of the big things to watch is phase two, when the Palestinian resistance begins to give prisoners of war of male Israeli soldiers, and how much that's going to cause. It's already Israel, it seems like the regime is breaking down. The political situation is so on fire. The most extreme elements, Ben Gavir and others saying, Smotrich, this is a huge defeat. It only gets worse the more and more that these prisoners of war, it seems like, are released, to the point where the media, Professor Baradi, is telling us that this is a huge embarrassment, and Israel is not taking it very well, meaning that the fighting could resume. But Palestinians have already proven, and the axis of resistance, that that fighting is only going to go so far. What do you say?
Well, in Syria, I don't think that these are pro-Assad forces. I think actually we are seeing the rise of new forces in Syria. And I think that's good for Syria because the Ba'athist party of Assad obviously was very corrupt. And while the resistance, the axis of resistance, defended the Syrian government, they were defending it against something that was much worse, and that was ISIS and Al Qaeda, against the very same people who have taken over the country today. Otherwise, it's not as if their previous government was uh, a government that was ideal for the Syrian people. But we do see this. We also saw an attack on Israeli regime positions in Syria by a resistance organization. So we're seeing things begin to happen in Syria, and also, it's not just the withdrawal of the Israelis. We saw the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians move to the north, and then we saw people power in Lebanon move to the south. And because at the end of the ceasefire, where the Israeli regime was supposed to withdraw, as expected, they didn't. And so the Lebanese mobilized supporters of the resistance, Christian, Muslim, Shia, Sunni, Druze, people who supported the resistance from all over Lebanon went to the south and went to their villages. And the Israeli regime was so disgusting that they gunned down ordinary people, including 6 women. But some very iconic images came out of that. There was a woman standing beside a tank and unafraid, and there was another woman who was being shot at by Israelis, and she stood her ground and told them to go back to their home countries. So it was, in a sense, it was a revolution or people power led by women of the resistance. So these I think were 2 powerful blows to the regime. And if the regime does choose to end the ceasefire and begin the genocide again, it's going to be much more difficult because Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah have been preparing themselves. They've also had a huge morale boost because people in Gaza have come and seen their power, their capabilities. The world has seen the narrative of the Israeli regime collapse, and Yemen is prepared to fire more missiles. And remember, Iran will ultimately punish if the fighting goes on. Iran will retaliate against the Israeli regime at some point. There's no doubt about that. I know some people have been saying, why hasn't Iran struck the regime? But as I said before, there were 2 elements. One was the fact that when Syria fell, and since Syrian airspace became more easily accessible to the Israeli regime, the Iranians had to recalculate how to set up air defenses to make sure the country is protected. And then we had the secret negotiations that were beginning in order to revive the ceasefire after Trump's victory. And the Iranians did not want that to be sabotaged. So during the, I think, 40 days roughly of negotiations, which Iran was deeply involved with because Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Ansarullah, they're in constant communication with one another. During that period, Iran was cautious not to allow the Israeli regime to have an excuse to refrain from establishing a ceasefire. But Israel right now is much more vulnerable than before. And as I said, the world is sick and tired of this genocide. Everyone's people are disgusted, but to restart this genocide after this defeat is going to be much more difficult. And also, since they've withdrawn from Gaza or most of Gaza right now, it's going to be they're going to go and have to fight. They're going to have to fight again to retake those territories. And in Lebanon, although they never really made any inroads, what they did was that after the ceasefire, they started taking territory. That's how untrustworthy this regime is. So they would go into towns and villages that they'd never been able to take during the war, and they would go in there and start burning down people's homes and the mosques and the shops, and they've been destroying village after village alongside the border. That's how despicable these people are. But people have, as I said, over the last few days, they've used people power, and they've pushed them out of most of these territories. If the regime initiates another conflict, it's not going to go well for it. It's going to be much worse than before. And I don't think that it's going to look good for Trump, because Trump uh, was showing this as a sign of his success, in that he was able to bring about a ceasefire before he came in, even before he came into office. And even though he's warned that he said that the ceasefire may not hold, but it won't look good for him if his allies and if his genocidal allies in Tel Aviv initiated something uh, where the world would see as just another excuse to bring about further genocide.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought all of this up in terms of the violations and the continued attempts by the Israeli regime to intimidate and even kill Lebanese and Palestinians throughout this period. Because, um, as you were talking, Professor Morandi, and you put out the idea that this could happen again, Israel could be regrouping. Indeed, that is true. But one thing that I think this moment has showed is that not only does Israel have to do everything you said with regard to Gaza, that they're going to have to reignite their genocidal campaign to try to take back territories that they never actually took in the first place, but they're also going to have to deal with the resistance, because Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for Hamas, said after the ceasefire that Iran, Hezbollah, Ansarallah, and the Iraqi resistance, and I don't know if I'm forgetting anyone, Professor Brandi, are all part of the reason why this ceasefire came about. Talk about how this factors into the equation of what Israel is able to do from here, given that they had October, February, January, what is this, 15 months to accomplish their objectives, and they didn't, and the resistance is still right there, as Abu Ubaidah proclaimed. So, your thoughts?
Yes, he gave special thanks to Hezbollah, and I think it is well deserved. Hezbollah, you know, the people of Gaza and the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the others, they were fighting for their survival. But Hezbollah willingly sacrificed their uh, members, their soldiers, their leaders to protect the people of Gaza, to draw away much of the Israeli regime forces. And in fact, during the 2 months of very heavy fighting between the regime and Hezbollah, that fighting, as I said earlier, was the most intense, not of just this war, but of all the wars that the regime has fought in its history. And Hezbollah held its ground. So it gave large numbers of martyrs among civilians and among supporters of the resistance and among the resistance itself, for the sake of another people, for the sake of the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza in particular. And in addition to that, Ansarullah, they did the same. They made sacrifices. They were constantly being bombed by the Americans and their sidekick in London, and also the Israelis, because they were implementing the Genocide Convention in the Red Sea, blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. And this is the same Ansarullah that survived 7 years of genocide itself, a genocide where the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar, with the support of Turkey, all of these countries were supporting the genocide in Yemen, along with NATO countries. They were all behind. Ansarullah was very much alone. Only later on, when there was a split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we saw that the Saudis and the Emiratis besieged Qatar, did Turkey and Qatar move away from Saudi Arabia. But so Yemen, which had survived 7 years of genocide, they were willing to make even more sacrifices for the sake of the people of Gaza. So he gave them special thanks alongside the resistance in Iraq and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But he also thanked Jordanian citizens who went into on their own, at their own initiative, not the government had nothing to do with it, into the West Bank and carried out operations against the Israeli regime, and they were all killed and they were all martyred fighting. There were, I think, 2 or 3 attacks, if I'm not mistaken. Your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. So if there is a revival, there's no doubt that as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Gaza. They will get new supplies. It's been going on throughout this period through the means that they have, which I have no idea how it works. And the same is happening in Lebanon. The same is happening in Yemen. They're all preparing themselves for the next phase. But it's going to be very costly for the regime if it revives this war. Again, the big as I said, all the areas that they've withdrawn from in Gaza, the resistance is preparing those territories for the future. So if they want to fight again, they'll have to retake all those territories. And but alongside that, the international community is going to be disgusted because they're saying, well, this is over now. Why are you seeking further trouble? They're releasing your prisoners, and it was very interesting, very smart move by the resistance to have these women, most of these women, wear their uniforms to remind the world that these weren't just a bunch of teenagers or young women that were taken. These were soldiers of the Israeli armed forces.